program for waiting school if you're in here, or not honorary, graduate studies. You have to go beyond the norm if you're here. All right, so let's all pray. Lord, thank you for Sunday school hour, and I pray that you bless it, and especially if others come in for different classes and stuff, I pray you bless all them. I thank you for Mom's message yesterday and the help it gave all of us, and I just pray that you would continue to work on the people that, especially the ones that committed last night and had such a radical change here. Lord, made waiting school worth the whole while, and so we just thank you for all those things you're doing in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, so this is kind of different. What we've been doing is we've been following Fletcher's life, and I've been trying to highlight kind of what the life of holiness looks like, because I think that's what he is. I think he's a great example of that. He would fall in the 1 Corinthians 11:1 passage where it says, "Follow my example as I follow the example of Christ." I think that's what he did, and it sounded a lot like I maybe overstated it yesterday at one point when I said that he, after Christ, he was probably the one that tried to live the most. But I mean, you can't look up a source today to this day and not find every source agree that he was a saintly man, which just blows my mind. I was looking up Wikipedia today because I can't get clear facts about what he was dying of. All I know is he was coughing blood. He had fevers at night. He had, and it was constantly plaguing him. And it became a chest. The physicians of that time that were looking at him over and over again were saying that it was some kind of chest problem, breathing wise. And so it would definitely affect that. And so it got to the point over the years. And so before I jump in that, I want to explain this. Geographically, we've been looking at him in Madley, which is one location in England where he is the pastor, which you remember that Wesley didn't necessarily agree with, and he thought he had a better option, which was to travel with him. And he had given him we've covered it if you guys were here with me in all the different times. He had 2 different invites to come join Wesley on the road. The reason Wesley did that was Wesley, when Fletcher died, Wesley was 80 years of age, and yet he was still in great shape. And how did he achieve that? Well, he achieved that from riding horseback, his whole entire life. So whenever he would hear that Fletcher was struggling, especially as a man who was so much younger than he was. Fletcher, if you remember, I think he died at 55 or 56 years old. When he, that would mean he was sanctified at about 52, that we can trace the information about. I was looking at that today. But geographically, he's been located in England. And now the whole section that we're focusing on today, he finally has to go. He has to go where he didn't want to go. I don't think he ever had it in his heart to go back to his homeland, Switzerland, but he did. So at first he was told that he needs to go to southern France to get better, from this horrible disease that he was dealing with. And he would have fits of horrible time where his body would try to take him out, and then he would have times where he really improved. And so it's interesting because we're talking just weeks apart, So he takes off to go to what he thinks is going to be southern France. He thinks it's going to be a short while. He had already tried to go to the baths in a certain area in England, and they're always telling you to do that. If you go there, your health's going to get better. And he had tried that. I mean, we even see it in movies today. I don't know if you guys saw, what was that boring movie that had a lot of politics in it? Oh, it's actually a good movie. Amazing Grace. I don't know if you've seen that movie. But he's at the baths trying to recoup himself from the same kind of chest problem he was having. And so that's exactly what Fletcher's going through. His health is getting worse and worse. And so he, like I told you before, he expected he was going to die. And so he kind of the highlight today, this morning, is his ability to witness in the midst of that. They had a family that was close to them named the Peronets, and I don't think most of us don't really know about it, but if you start reading Wesley and you start reading anybody around him, you're going to hear that name because there's a bunch of them. There's William. There was different Peronet family members, and their dad was the holiest. He was the coolest one, and he was still alive. But William Peronet came down on his trip, so about midway through it. And he ended up staying in Switzerland, not for a few, or France. He didn't end up only staying in France. His I think it was a brother of his came over and brought him back to his homeland. And you know how that is. I mean, guys, we've seen people, if I can use this term, migrate, to here at Southside Church of the Nazarene. And what happens after a while is their family members try to draw them to their home. You know what I mean? Because they miss them. It's just obvious facts, okay? And so that's exactly what happened. I can remember him while he was in England getting letters where they were saying, come back to Switzerland. And he said, I have no interest in that. God's doing this and that, right? Well, his health forced him to have to go. And so that's interesting again, because here we go again with Fletcher, who's kind of kicking against the grain, where he's not being what he's supposed to be. He's been being a pastor, and he's not being the evangelist Wesley wants him to be. And the only way now he can survive is if he starts traveling. And if you notice that he tried to travel with Wesley, and guys, he almost recouped. You'll hear that there's a point where he was just maybe months away. If he hadn't stopped in London and had his friends talk him into staying with them, he would have been able to go on to, better health. You see what I mean? Wesley thought he was on the mend for sure. And so, guys, when he first leaves for France, in about a week or so from that, or 3 weeks, 2 weeks, something like that, he ran into Wesley. And Wesley said, man, Fletcher's totally on the mend. Do you see what I mean? And it's just weird because it's just like storm patterns. I mean, just a week later, he's sick again, And so again, he's coughing up blood. The most telltale thing of what he had was he was coughing up blood all the time. And Wesley believed, because it's put in the funeral sermon of Fletcher, which had a biography that he wrote. Wesley wrote a biography of Fletcher, and I was trying to tell you guys yesterday, there's 3 of them that are important. There's some other smaller ones I ran into today that I was studying, but the ones that are mainly known are Luke Tyerman's, John Wesley's, and then Joseph Benson's. Those are the ones that are really well known. And but anyway, in the story, Fletcher has a lot of problems with his health, guys, and he becomes very old looking. He says by the time he's done with the controversy, his hair's grayed completely, and he's struggling with his health. And I kind of rechecked some of the facts today, looking at some of the guys that kind of skip ahead and around the story. But they said that he had seen his wife, I don't even know how many years before. It must have been 20, I don't know. It was pretty early on. His wife to be, and he was attracted to her, and he liked her right away. And he was going to ask her to marry him, and then he didn't go through with it because some, probably conscience-stricken issue, and so he didn't go through with it. And she falls in love with him in the years when he starts to get sick. So he really carried this illness. Probably, I don't really know exactly. Probably in the mid 1760s, all the way till 1780s. He struggled with his. Well, no, it was in the debate, so it'd probably be 1770s for sure, somewhere in there. But anyway, so he struggled with this disease for a long time, whatever it was. And so you would think because of those limitations, I mean, guys, his world became very small. His one traveling friend is Mr. Ireland, and Mr. Ireland speaks French. And when he tries to go back to his homeland, he can't remember French that well, which kind of proves that one of his goofy writings that mixes up the issue of baptism in the Holy Spirit wasn't written in this period of his life, because he didn't speak it very well anymore. When you get away from your native land for so long, you don't remember your language. And so he actually wrote Ireland and said, can you help me with that when I go back? And Ireland became his traveling friend, and he took him there, and then he drops him off and he stays. And so he stays in southern France, and he tells you certain happenings that happen there. And he tries to witness. And what's interesting is immediately his health boosts, He starts doing horseback rides. One of the horseback rides that so his world becomes very small. All he has is people traveling with him who are either kind of like his physicians or his friend. You know what I mean? One traveling friend. And so they're writing their parents, and telling people. So William Perronet and others, they were telling people what was going on with him. And one of the experiences he had when he was sick like that was that his doctors were kind of funny back then. I don't know if you guys know that, but he's getting prescribed from everybody, just like today. When I was sick, I remember people who have dietary views of how they're going to heal your health. And then I know there's people who are going to say, no, you need to go to medicine. There's people that are going to say you need surgery. They're going to say, whatever it is. Well, he was getting advice from everywhere. And one person told him the idea, and I believe it was a Christian woman, told him an idea that he should somehow take bark. And I don't even know how you do that. I don't know if it's ingested by eating it, I don't know what he was doing, but somehow that improved him. He also talks about having grapes with him all the time, and he was eating grapes. And for some reason, this stuff would help him somewhat, with his coughing issue and stuff. But it was really funny when it came down to his real physician, and because they would do stupid things, in that day sometimes. I mean, one of the stupid things is they would bleed him, and I'm sure that didn't help him. They did that 4 times in a row, and at one point, and guys, that's how they killed George Washington here in America. You know what I'm saying? It doesn't work, to bleed people. If they had read, I remember Kent Hovind saying that over and over again. If they just read the Bible, they realized the life is in the blood, so don't do that. You know what I mean? And he said that he killed George Washington. Well, it's the same thing with him. They weakened him a lot of times with their superstitious little ideas of how to heal people. Well, so I want you guys to picture this. He's somewhere in his 50s, okay? And he looks like an older man. And he's staying with, I think this is his friend Paranet at the time. And the doctor said this. The doctor said, if you can ride horseback, and I was just going to tell you that the furthest he ever rode was like 120 miles. That's pretty crazy on horseback for a man suffering from some kind of serious, congestion and blood issue coming from his lungs. And he would do this daily. He would ride his horse. So that seemed logical. You know what I mean? That's what kept Wesley alive. That's why Wesley said he needs a change of air. He would say, you need to ride horseback, and if you just stay with me, And so he added that into his life, and he was doing that every day. And at this period in his struggling life. But I want you to picture this 50-something-year-old looking very aged man, skinny, obviously, doesn't eat that much, who used to stay 12, actually it was 14 to 16 hours some days during the debate. And so he had hurt himself, and he had kind of not eaten meals right and everything. So he admits, and Wesley admits in that funeral sermon, that he hurt himself during his studies because he studied too hard. You get what I mean? Physically. And the Bible says that. The Bible says much study wears the body. You know what I mean? So they were reading the scripture, but there's certain things you just kind of forget here and there. But anyway, so I want you to picture him sitting in this little house, with him. And he had different people stay with him because, again, he's not well, and they can't really leave him alone because he could die. And so he couldn't preach. And one of the interesting things is that I'm trying to tell you about his witness is that he could hand signal. And so anybody who was around him would say, shut up. That was what their job was to do, was to keep him quiet because he wanted to witness to everybody. And so he'd have somebody come up, and he would immediately walk out to them, and he would try to invite them to his house, and he would tell them about Christ. And it didn't matter if they were his opponents. He had one of his opponents, Barrage. He hadn't seen him in 16 years. And he ran out to him and, showed love to him, and the man immediately melted. And do you see what I mean? And they put their debate issues aside, and they leave in an awesome Christian spirit. So that was his typical behavior. And you can see there's one point where he says, as he was trying to witness the last tail bit, and this is a friend reporting it, one of his caretakers told him to shut up and told him to go in the house, you know what I mean? And so he had to kind of be pulled away. And that was just their behavior. They were always telling him. And guys, even when he couldn't talk, during that whole period of time, he would use hand signals pointing people to Christ. He would use imagery, in the room. He was gifted. Wesley said if anybody else tried that, they'd be weird, But he could find anything. I mean, they drew a portrait of him. And I think I mentioned this to you guys because they didn't have photos back then, So he was sitting there having a portrait done of him. And while they were doing that, he was talking to him about Christ, everybody in the room. And he was talking about, you don't need the imprint of my, me in your life. You need the imprint of Christ on your heart and your life. And he would, see what I mean? He was just a master of doing that. Now, what's really interesting to me too, and what I'm trying to get you to picture is kind of funny, because the man who's staying with him, William Paranet, he says, I'm watching this aged man, and his physician tells him, I want you to ride horseback if you can. And he says, and if you can't do that, because sometimes he'd get tired, and I told you he'd ride in Wesley's Chase with him when he was with him. Well, he'd say, if you can't do that, I want you to do, walking. And so in other words, he's trying to get him to do more of physical attainment himself, not having a beast do it for him, And so he says, and this stuff makes sense, and he says, and if you can walk, maybe you can actually run a little bit, and he'd say, if you could do that, I want you to do that. And he'd say, but the best of all is you need to leap. And so William Barnett writes his dad and says he sees this gray-haired, skinny man jumping across the room as far as he can do. I just picture Fletcher, long jumping, you know what I mean? I think that's kind of funny. And anyway, so, these are the kind of fun things about him. But he was trying everything he could. Guys, that's cool if you really think about it. Because he would say, I'm totally resigned to Christ. If you talk to Methodists in that day, they would always tell you that. I'm resigned to his will. If I'm going to die, I'm going to die. Do you see what I'm saying? And I've totally trusted in him 1,000,000%, and I'm ready, okay? But he was fighting with everything in him to stay alive. Do you see what I'm saying? He didn't just succumb to ailment, disease, physical trial. And guys, when it lasts for 9 years or something like that, where you're just miserably tortured day and night. I mean, he said he's reporting good news. He's like, and he doesn't grumble. He's writing letters, and that's how he communicated back then. And so he says, for all these days, at least I still have fever, and I still have at nights. Do you see? To sit there every day struggling with that, have no way to test yourself, know what's happening with your body, and know that you're coughing up blood. But here's the good news section. You see what I mean? And then he would talk about his love for God and stuff like that. Well, there's two characteristics of this at this time that I needed to tell you about. One of them is that everybody he wrote, he's talking about sanctification. So he's not just witnessing about salvation. He's writing everybody, his wife to be. He's writing anybody. So anybody he can talk to, he talks to them about their spiritual need individually. But if he can't go out of his house, you can tell he was confined a lot of this time. That trip ends up being 4.5 years. Can you imagine being taken away from Wesley and you were in the limelight. You were second to Wesley. Everybody wanted you to be Wesley himself and follow through, and all of a sudden you get dragged away from your spotlight, and you don't have Madley anymore. You don't have your little locale where you're preaching to, and all the people in the evangelistic route he put up there. You don't have any of that, and he has to get his stuff arranged. So he has a Mr. Greaves comes in. That's his last name, and he becomes his curate, but he can't give communion. And so he has to secure him a priest, and he gets that done so that the priest can come in from the neighboring area and give his people communion because they're used to having that, He has to figure out how that guy's going to live because Fletcher was so selfless and his money was so little. Do you see what I'm saying? He had to make sure the man had money to live on. And so he would offer his horse. He gave him his house. You can hear him. A lot of these letters are about that kind of stuff where he's sending from Switzerland or from France, here's what you need to do with my church. And then he would additionally add to it, here, Madley, this is what you need to do. And he tells the church at Madley, you guys have this going for you or you don't. And then he would say, please don't meet me at the judgment day in the same sins I found you in. You know what I mean? He would give them pushes, but all those different talks, most of the time it was about sanctification. He'd say, and I have a prayer I want you guys to offer for me. He'd say, he was talking about his ordination, and he said, when I was standing before God and I was making my decision to be a priest, I made a promise, a vow, that I would serve you guys and love him to the highest level you can possibly love God. And I'd love my neighbor. And he said, I have not loved him that way. And he says, and I apologize for that because he's saying he's not sanctified. Do you see what I mean? And so he was very honest with his group and all his friends, and he would say, pray for me to be sanctified. But he wouldn't do it discouragingly. He would also write them and say, so you guys need to pray to be sanctified, And he pressed that on them as hard as he possibly could. He summarized his preaching to them in December, for example, 28th of the year 1776. That was the year he was about to leave. And he said, this is what my preaching for the last 17 years. So remember, he only preaches to them for 25. And so he's already done it 17 years. He's been their pastor. And he says, number one, I told you when I was there to repent both of actual sins and original sin. See what I mean? So he's trying to tell you need to get saved and you need to get sanctified, And he's saying, so keep that up. Number two, he told you to believe all the gospel. See, this is kind of cool that he could summarize all his preaching to them in 4 points. And he's saying, obviously, it's not enough just to repent. You have to believe to receive entire sanctification. And so you need to believe all of it. And then he says, I want you to, number 3, walk in obedience. This is his summation of Christianity at this point in his life. And then he says, number 4, I want you to grow in grace. And guys, that's the keys, to everything right there. Get saved, get sanctified, and walk in obedience and grow in grace. You see what I mean? And so this is the type of pastoral ministry he would do from a distance. And so his curate took care of it the whole time, and he did increase. And one other thing he was able to do was he was able to establish a meeting house. I don't know if you guys know what that is from that term. In Wesley's term, that was a church. So we would say he was planning a church. Well, while he was gone, they didn't have anything to even preach in his whole Madeley quarters except for the church. You see what I mean? And so when they wanted to hold evangelistic meetings, he wanted to have a house for it, so he paid for that. He arranged for the payment of it. You know what I mean? And it actually ended up being a problem, like a lot of times it would happen for Wesley, where it became a debt. When he wasn't there, he didn't even know what his accounts were doing. Do you see? I mean, you talk about hard to check in on your Fifth Third account, or wherever you're at. He couldn't even look it up. He couldn't figure out where his finances were, so he'd write a letter and, receive back news whenever he could. And he was saying, please tell me what's in my account, and I'm sorry for the hassle it's caused, those that are taking over the building and the land over there and trying to figure it all out. Well, ultimately, it got built, and during the time he was gone. And Wesley was able to preach in it, and Wesley said his report was kind of mixed. It was, this is so cool that he has this now, but the people following his discipline haven't been able to follow it. Do you see what I mean? So Wesley was kind of, he's really good at analyzing a crowd. I don't know how you come into a church in one visit and you know all that about them, and Wesley was an expert at that, So it was kind of cool. And so the second thing that's really critical, and I want you guys to hear, and I think this is so cool because it shows, again, how close his heart was knit with Wesley's, which I think was knit with God's, which was that his whole ministry focus while he was in Switzerland became children, which is just crazy to me. I remember when I don't know if you guys were here, because I don't know what year you guys came in, but when I was teaching my first book, which would be going way back, because we went 1, 2, 3, okay? When I went through that first book, there was a whole chapter on the lives of the Methodist people and how they carried on the message, so that was chapter 22. And if you kept going deeper, there's a whole chapter as we got closer to the end, which is chapter 26. There's one before that where it says, Wesley believes the revival is going to come through the next generation, all right? So Wesley's focus in his older years was the children, you see what I mean? And they both had, and guys, I want you to hear this because it's really crazy to me. They both had an uncanny ability to walk up to children and have an impact on them that just makes no sense. I wish that some of us, see, that's why I appreciate the Rayburns and stuff, because they've explored that aspect of their Christianity a lot. And guys, it is a really neat thing. Amanda has explored that in recent years in her life. I can't remember them all. Sarah Pettit has. There's a lot of people in our church that have tried to go into the children a bit and work with them, and Diane's doing that. Well, what's so neat about it is that Fletcher goes out in one of his horse riding experiences, right? And as he's riding down the road on a horse, which is hard to keep up with, he sees a bunch of little kids. And he comes up amongst them, which is, you got to remember that people in that day were really spooked about abnormal behavior, and just like they are today. But this was more related to church behavior. They were afraid of what they called enthusiasm, which is basically you're acting cuckoo, okay? And and it was basically kind of a fear similar to our fear today in America about Pentecostalism, where you would be afraid that expressions of God are too much. So they really judged Wesley, Whitefield, all of Methodism as kind of people who are going too far with religion. Do you see what I mean? And so they really didn't like behavior, especially in England and in now, I guess, in neighboring countries. They didn't like when you would do something abnormal to your church leadership, And so for a parson to come over from another land and just start, doing his ministry labors amongst people that weren't his own, it was unheard of. So that's why they struggled with the idea of Wesley's evangelist. He didn't want, the whole land was set up where this is my parish, just like it is today in America. This is my parish. The pastors would say, this is my church. And so to have you ride over on horseback and just start ministering to somebody who's not your parishioner was unheard of, and it was weird, And so he started getting persecution. So you wouldn't think that old, aged Fletcher, with health issues, with a caretaker and hardly a life that really gets outside of his little house other than the fact he's writing letters, okay? You wouldn't think that he would have a whole bunch of persecution, but he did. There's a bailiff of some sort. I'm not even familiar with the term, but it was some bailiff of the land that got angry at him because of these, excesses in his mind to what he was doing religiously. And so he got mad at him. Why? Well, because one Sunday he came out and he said, guys, and this shows again his temperament and his thought process about the scriptures. He said, I accuse this land of two things. Number one, they break the Sabbath. And he said, number two, they're into, in this area, they're into playing at what we would say like plays, which would be similar to movies, but they had a secular, direction. And yeah. Okay. Well, and there's a word before it too, but so he's telling me a bailiff in Great Britain was sheriff. And so this man felt that he was accusing him when he heard that he said those two things, because one, he had just brought a group in to do plays in the area, and he had allowed some behavior on Sundays, so he was angry about it. He thought it was a personal attack on him, and he also tried to make it sound like because he was in the order of leadership in the area, he made it sound like it was a reflection on the government of the area, and so he tried to put Fletcher away. So before that happened, I got to tell you why. So this is the cool part. Fletcher goes out on horseback, and he's riding down. He sees these little kids sitting in the area, and he stops and he conversates with them. And again, it always was like this with him and Wesley. He gets one conversation, and I'm not really sure. I think it was something kind of like God's providence. I'm not sure what the subject was anymore, okay? But something along that lines where he's just pointing out that God's the creator, and they're outside. Do you see what I mean? And he gives them some kind of illustration. Well, the little kids were so moved by his talk that he's on horseback and he's riding back to his house, and they started running after him. And they tried to keep up with him all the way to his home that he was staying in, and they couldn't, of course. Some of them could, and they followed him all the way there, and that night he had a conversation with them. Well, it's so cool because kids do cool things, you know what I mean? And so the next day he goes out in the wooded area, which is obviously nobody's parish, all right? I mean, it's just woods. He goes out there, and literally 100 children show up. And that wasn't the next night. He had been meeting with that little group of kids for a few days. But shortly after that, do you see what I'm saying? They go out and tell their buddies, and 100 kids are out in the woods that day. And he finally has his health up to par, and he preaches to them, which I think would be a very short sermon, because when William Perrott gets with him, he said, I've heard him preach 4 times. And he said, he's getting lengthier. He couldn't preach in the beginning. Do you see? I mean, it was just barely talk. But he's coming to where he can preach. That's how much God is helping him in his native land. And guys, I can tell that right now. I grew up over here in Kazoo, right? And out in the farmland where Amanda lives, they spray it day in and day out. And I just get 8 miles from there and my asthma kicks in. Do you get what I mean? And all the way out there it gets worse and worse. And then when I come back over here, if I'm here for an hour, if I was ever just sitting here, I'd better wait for an hour. Do you see what I mean? I have to clear up from whatever that experience is because it's clearly affecting me. Well, he's like that. He gets over there to his homeland, and he's breathing better, and he's recouping most of the time. That's what you see. You see a great advance in his health. How do we know? Because he preached more than 20 times while he was there, and he couldn't preach at all when he was in England. He had lost that ability from the ailment. And so anyway, these kids hear him, and what's really cool about it is he said there's equal number of adults there. So, that first engagement, he has 200 people because kids. And which was Wesley's move at that time. Do you see? I mean, Wesley was trying to secure a new generation of kids to be new Methodists and be focusing on the same thing. And so pretty soon he's wanting to leave. You got to remember he did not plan to be down in even to go to his homeland. And while he was there, he had another excursion. William Perrott had come down there, and he had agreed by letter to help him to secure a property of his own. So I don't really know how that all plays in. I don't know if it was his father's previous, land or whatever it was, but somewhere close by, so he had to go through a mountain range. They had to go together traveling over there in his ailment. And of course that didn't help him, you know what I mean? And so there's one point where the horse couldn't make it through the snow. The snow was higher than we see here in Michigan and stuff like that. It's crazy, all right? And so they're trying to get through because they said the William Perrott was complaining one time, And he said the winters here are horrible and the summers are really hot. You see what I mean? So there's just this, it's kind of like Mid-America's experience. You know, there's no fall, you know what I mean? And there's no spring. It's just summer, winter, summer, winter. You know what I mean? That's just all there is. And so he was having that kind of experience. And so that kind of stuff for him was natural. But he gets up in the mountains like that and the horses give out. You know, they're too weak. And so you can hear the concern of Paranet as he's saying now he has to walk. And so, guys, before he left England, no, actually, when he, I'm trying to remember when that was. I think that was before he left for his trip. He was ailing already, right? And so his friend had to walk him in to the annual conference. And, you know, so he walks in like this with somebody helping him in. And he gets up in front of everybody with what's left of his voice, you know, and he preaches to him. You know, he's already trying to mend himself. And he was, to some degree, he had gotten a little bit better again. And so he tries to share with them. And there's so many reports of that one event. You know, he was so powerful. He said, so one man, I think it was the man he was staying with at the time in England, or on his first part of his trip, he said to him, he said, I watched this man preach, and he said, I've never seen a man give about a half dozen sentences and have the whole room in tears. You know, he said, I mean, this is Wesley's Methodists. They're all the evangelists. It's like, Tyerman calls it a cool name. He says this is a convocation of all his evangelists. Do you see what I'm saying? And they're all sitting in that room, and they drag in Fletcher like that. And this is at the beginning of his trip. And he just shares, like, they said, like a half dozen lines. That's it, something like that, or somewhere between that and like 12 lines, something like that. And by the time he got done saying what he was saying, you know, the whole room was weeping because they couldn't feel, they've never felt such an impact of a guy who was like that, alone with God. You see, I mean, he was always like that. And guys, his prayer didn't, you know, get weaker when he's alone. You know, he would say, the one thing the devil can't take away from me is I can pray. You know what I mean? And so he was alone. And it's really cool because there's a point, which I really want to share with you if I can find it, where he talks about the agony that Mom always talks about in a more detailed way. So let me get that real quick. It's short, but you'll like it. All right, so here he is. This is somewhere in mid-trip, and he says, he's writing about his spiritual experiences, the deep ones he's had, and this actually is memory. It's not current. Okay, so this is times past. And first he gives this story like this. He says, in the beginning of his ministry, he says, back when he first came to England, of my spiritual course, I heard the voice of God. And Mom will talk like this. She always talks about how she wants to hear the audible voice of God again, like she did when she first became a Christian. And he said, I heard the voice of God in an articulate but inexpressibly awful sound. This isn't the agony. This is just his warm-up to that. He's giving another story. And he says, go through my soul in those words. If any man will be my disciple, let him deny himself. You know, and he said, at a later date, I was favored like Moses with a supernatural discovery of the glory of God and an ineffable converse with him face to face, so that whether I was then in the body or out of the body, I cannot tell. Isn't that cool? You know, he's basically saying, you know, I was an early Christian, and God said, you must deny yourself, you know, and then he hears that voice go across his soul in a way that just like breaks him. But while he's sitting there, he gets to go face to face with God. I mean, you don't hear about that. And this isn't way back in Moses' day, you know, Old Testament, you know, thousands of years ago. You see, I mean, this is a man who was just a few hundred years ago alive. And he as an early Christian, you know, he gets an experience like that. Can you imagine? All right. And he doesn't talk about his inner experiences a lot. That's why it's cool when he finally does, you know, you want to write them down. Well, right after that, probably in the same letter, he speaks about his lost agony. He said, about the time of my entering into the ministry, so right when he was called into priesthood, when he finally did that, I one evening wandered into a wood, musing in the importance of the office I was going to undertake. Guys, it's hard. When you get ordained, there's a sense of, it's like marriage, you know, there's a sense of responsibility that's coming upon you. Like, man, the church is telling me that they agree, and I got to, you know, do the work of an evangelist like I said I would. I have to be everything I'm supposed to be. And so he felt that kind of thing on him. He said, so I was thinking about the ministry I was about to undertake. He said, I then began to pour out my soul in prayer. Hear this. When such a sense of the justice of God fell upon me, and such a sense of his displeasure at sin, as absorbed all my powers and filled me with the agony of prayer for poor lost sinners. He said, I continued therein till the dawn of day. Isn't that crazy? So, he said, God gave me this agony in my spirit and a sense of his justice and his hatred towards sin, and it just sat on me. Overnight. Isn't that crazy? Like to be able to have an experience like that, And he says, I continued there until the dawn of day, and I considered this as designed of God to impress upon me more deeply the meaning of those solemn words. Therefore, knowing the terrors of the Lord, we persuade men. Do you see what I mean? So, in other words, because he fears God, he's going to tell people that they're going to go to hell, and he's going to preach it. And that's why he became that hellfire preacher that he was. And guys, he still had that impact. I mean, when he would preach, no matter how short it was, with his ill health, lives were changed. Do you see what I mean? He would have an impact. But I really find it awesome that no matter what, they couldn't zip his lip. No matter what the devil tried to do, he couldn't shut him up. He couldn't tell him no. He couldn't make him stop witnessing. When I was watching Maddie do what she was doing, did you see? I was reading this stuff. And it was cool to see her go out with the same kind of mentality. She just sees souls. She couldn't care less about, her things that she had that worry her and stress her and stuff. She was thinking about that for waiting school. She was thinking, I want to get people in here. I want them to, and so see, guys, that's the kind of mentality he has. But you see how different it would be if we did as much preparation for those encounters in prayer, where we were always in that kind of atmosphere behind the scenes. So when somebody interacts with us, they really get Jesus. Do you get what I mean? Really get him. And so anyway, so I thought that was cool. Just a second. So anyway, so he has a lot of impact still, and so I think his friend died. It's kind of hard to tell. He says that he was in his dying disease. William Pernet was, and it is the last time it's mentioned in the book, so I would assume he died. The way he kind of finished off the sentence, he said, and his trouble, it was kind of sounding like, and his troubles were over. I'm not sure if he did die or not, but that's what, at that point. He was trying to go back to England, and so I was trying to tell you, for years he was trying to go back to England. He kept saying, I'm going to try to go back. But the minute he would try, he'd have something come up where he'd have to move houses. He was currently staying in his dad's house, where his dad used to live. And so he was in that house where he had actually grown up, and they describe it and everything. But he had to move. And I think that kind of is what led his friend to an ailment. So it sounds to me like for one period of time he's by himself. And because it was kind of a weird letter that William Pernet wrote before he died. He said, I look into the room and I see this feeble man with all his books around him. Do you know what I mean? And he's in there working away. Well, that's when he wrote one of his most people say it's one of his most impacting writings. It's called the Portrait of St. Paul. And it's a writing that he did in 78, something like that. And so they were trying to go home, but they didn't want to do it in the winter. And it was already September, and that's when he gives you that little window where he's doing that, He says, so I fear, because this is becoming, he said, I'm watching his book, as he's writing it by hand, and he's saying it's becoming much thicker. So he says, I'm afraid we're going to have to go again through another horrible winter here, And, well, he was right. So Pernet never gets to go back with him. And so he ends up staying, for 4.5 years, away from his Madly. And the whole time, there's certain issues where he's writing them and trying to witness to them. Most of everything from that point becomes letter after letter where he's just going, you guys need to be sanctified. He's saying, and so one thing I did in this section is I talk about briefly, but I'm going to try to expand it a little bit, is our guy who teaches us about Fletcher, today, Lawrence Wood, one thing he gets wrong is that he has it right in general that there's a connection between Fletcher's concern about Pentecost and his concern about end times. He's right about that, but he's wrong about his view of end times. Okay, so it's so simple to misguide somebody. But all you have to do with that false teaching, is say, well, he thinks the millennium's coming, so therefore, do you see what I mean? That's because he's a post-millennialist. He thinks that there's going to be this ushered in, and he's making an association with Pentecost. From his view, which I've already proven to you was wrong yesterday, because he just thinks it's an expansion of Pentecost. Well, he does say something similar to that, but he's discrediting Pentecost for being the millennium. Do you see what I mean? It's the exact reverse of the idea. He's not telling you Pentecost is the beginning of the last days. He's not telling you it's the fulfillment of it. And he's not telling you we're in that period of revival and Christ is coming next, okay? As in the second coming. He's not telling you that. And so, as we saw yesterday, I spent all day showing you guys all the evidence that Fletcher clearly believed that there's going to be a tribulation and that we're before that, and that he believes he's going to escape it. Even if he dies, he believes he's going to escape it because he'll be able to be in the first resurrection if he gets sanctified. And he connects that very clearly in his teaching and shows it's a Wesleyan teaching. And then he says that after the tribulation period, there's going to be a second coming, and he's of Christ, and he says he's going to, stop all the enemies of Christ, and he gives you all those horrible descriptions of what Christ is going to do to the enemies of him and the Antichrist. And he says, and then there's going to be the millennium, and he goes into hundreds of details on that. You know what I mean? And I only gave you guys some to whet your appetite yesterday, but it is cool that he clearly taught different than what they're saying. Okay. So you guys remember when I was giving you the idea of him coming in the conference and speaking? I want you to hear this from his own words. And we still have some time, right? Is it regular hour? Regular? All right, so he says, this is a man, I'm not sure which one wrote this one down. David Lloyd wrote it down. He was a person who was there the day that Fletcher talked to the annual conference. And this is his picture of it. He says, on the forenoon of a day when the sitting of the conference was drawing to a close, tidings announced of Mr. Fletcher. So they were really shocked. They didn't think he'd come in because of his health state and everything. As he entered the vestibule of the new room, which is the place where Wesley was meeting then, it used to be the foundry, and it became the new room later, And so he says, as he entered into that, supported by Mr. Ireland, of course, that was the man who was under his arm, I can never forget the visible impulse of esteem which his venerable presence excelled in the house. He said, why this touches me is because it just his presence, just walking in a room, would change everybody. You see what I'm saying? And it was very similar with Asbury. Asbury was a very holy man like that too. But it says, the whole assembly stood up as if moved by an electric shock. See, this is cool because this is an original scene. You got an eyewitness telling you it. Mr. Wesley rose ex cathedra and advanced a few paces to receive his highly respected friend and reverend brother, whose visage seemed strongly to bode that he stood on the verge of the grave. See, they all knew he was dying. Every time somebody would give a report about him when he was in England, they were saying he looked like he was dying. While his eyes, sparkling with seraphic love, like an angel's love, indicated that he dwelt in the suburbs of heaven. And his languid but happy state, he addressed the conference on their work and his own views in a strain of holy and pathetic eloquence, which no language of mine can adequately express. See what I mean? It's cool because even trying to repeat what he heard was hard to do with what Fletcher said. He says, the influence of his spirit and pathos seemed to bear down all before it. I never saw such an instantaneous effect produced in a religious assembly, either before or since. He said he had scarcely pronounced a dozen sentences before 100 preachers, to speak in round numbers, were immersed in tears. Time can never efface from my mind the recollection and image of what I then felt and saw. He says, such a scene I never expect to witness again on this side of eternity. Mr. Wesley, in order to relieve his languid friend from the fatigue and injury, see, he wanted to keep going, and they always had to stop him because he would keep going. He said, which might arise from a too long and arduous exertion of the lungs through much speaking, abruptly kneeled down at his side. So this is so cool, guys, because Wesley interrupts him. And Wesley comes over to him, and he kneels down next to him, and he says, I want to pray for you. You know what I mean? And Wesley prays for Fletcher's healing right there. And guys, they're able to report that for the next 8 years, Fletcher stayed alive. Isn't that cool? And if you go far into Tireman's stories about Wesley, the same thing happened to him. He was dying at some point in his mid to late life, and so they anointed for him. And when they did, he lived 15 years from that date to the day. You see what I mean? Which is crazy, and Tireman has that written down. But I want you to hear the rest of it. I'll put it in his words. He says, Wesley abruptly kneeled down at his side, the whole Congress of preachers doing the same. So every that'd be so cool to have the original Wesley band sitting around you, kneeling around you as an older man who's struggling with this, and they pray for you. But listen, he says he prayed for Mr. Fletcher's restoration to health. No, wait, he says, in a concise and energetic manner, he prayed for Mr. Fletcher's restoration to health and a longer exercise of his ministerial labors. Mr. Wesley closed his prayer with the following prophetic promise. Isn't this cool? He said, he pronounced in his peculiar manner and with a confidence and emphasis which seemed to thrill through every heart, he shall not die. Isn't that cool? He says, but live and declare the works of the Lord. The event verified the prediction. Mr. Fletcher lived for 8 succeeding years, exerting all the zeal of a primitive missionary and enjoying all the esteem of a holy patriarch. So I think it's cool that after he did all this arguing with people, which people say divides and doesn't do any good and everything else, his first mission, which I kind of left out and I forgot to tell you, is he becomes very peacemaking. He wants to be the one that reconciles the Calvinists and Arminians. So a lot of his last writings where he's trying to make everybody get along. Do you see what I'm saying? And I think that's pretty cool because if you remember, the Calvinists caused the fight and the Arminians trying to end it. Do you see what I'm saying? He's trying to make them act like Christians and get past their blind spots and realize the benefits of each group and stuff like that, which, gets you weary when you're an Arminian. You're like, be very careful, Fletcher. Don't tell them that they're off the hook after all you've argued. You know what I'm saying? And what's interesting is, of course, Calvinists tried to say that. Whenever the same thing happened with Arminians, when they heard that a big Calvinist apologized or tried to make things right, they would say, see, he gave up his opinions, and they would lie about him, and a rumor would start. Well, the same thing tried to happen with him on occasion, but the truth is when they looked through all the evidence, all the ones that were closest to him said he never gave up one point that he had held them to during the debate. But he was able to show Arminians too. If you guys remember, he was correcting Arminians too for their legalism and their misdirection of certain things that they had focused on too. And all right. Let me see here. The only reason it's a little shorter is because we had the parts yesterday where he gave all his end times view, which is interjecting all this stuff. But he does end up being able to go back to England. So he's in, I don't know if you guys remember where he lived. I think it's an odd name. I had it this morning, something Switzerland. I'm trying to remember if it's Lion or some word like that. Anyway, whatever word it was, one day he's basically there, and 3 weeks later he's in England. So after this horrible time of trying to get home, over and over and over again, and being left by himself and writing things and struggling with his friends dying around him and going through that horrible trip I told you about where he went up into the mountains. What I was trying to tell you is when he got in that deep snow, he slipped and he fell and he hit his head, and so there's just times where it got really hard for him, But he did that out of love for that family, the Paranet family. He wanted to help him. And so they had to carry him up through the rest of the trip, and on and on it goes. But he would do anything he could for to exemplify Christ. But all right. So in just a second. Here, listen to this word, guys. On that trip where he slipped and he fell, and he was just trying to help his friend. This is William Paranet talking about him during that time, and he tells you how he was even on that trip. Listen to this. He says, and this is one of the coolest statements. I'm glad I didn't leave it out. He says, wherever he goes, he's talking about Fletcher. He says, wherever he goes, he preaches the gospel. Isn't that cool? He says, both by his words and example, nay, by his very looks. Do you hear that? I told you that earlier. He says, not only to his friends, but to all whom he meets. So that on the top of the frozen Alps, that's where they were when he fell, and in the dreary vale of Chateau des Oaks, or whatever it is, I don't know how to say that word, good seed has been sown. At that place, Chateau, whatever, he was visited by some of the principal inhabitants who stood around him in deep attention for almost an hour while he exhorted and prayed. And so I think that's awesome, So even no matter where he went, he didn't waste his effort, he didn't waste his time. Again, every opportunity he had, he shared. Which makes him really cool. One example of that I was trying to mention to you guys yesterday, which I'm glad to close that too, so you'll understand that. Remember when I told you that he ran into the Pope when he in the middle of his boost of health when he went south. When he was in the warmer temperatures. When he did that, he got a little bit better, so he was able to travel a little bit. So his friend that he was traveling with at the time, I think it was Mr. Ireland, They did a whole tour of Italy, you know, and so when he did that, he, of course, as he's going down the road, he gets the news from the crowd in front of him that the Pope is coming. Okay, and so when this happened, there's a threat in the area, you know, that if you didn't bow when he walked by you, they'd club you, or you know, they'd hit you. And so of course when that happened, him and Mr. Ireland, they wouldn't bow. Everybody else in the whole area did. And he said if his voice had allowed him to preach, he would have told everybody that the Antichrist was coming. You know what I mean? And I mean if it doesn't show what he thought, and it just gives you kind of an illustration of how, you know, fearless Fletcher was. I want to give you one more, and this one will get Brad on to it. Okay, this is a crazy thing up his alley, and I'll end on it. He had a felon for a nephew. So here he is, aged, and he's ill, and he's sick, and he can barely hold himself up. He's holding on to doorways when he's standing and so forth. And he gets this report that comes to him. He backs the story up and tells you what happened, okay, because he didn't know this at the time, but he figured it out later. So he tells you the whole story. What happened was his brother, you know, was wealthy, and his brother was attacked by his nephew. You know, he came up with a pistol and threatened him with his life and said, if you don't give me, you know, this amount of money, and he exacted the amount, 500 pounds, whatever it was. He said, I'm going to kill you right here on the spot. And the man tried to reason with him some, but he wouldn't listen, you know, and he didn't kill him, but he stole the money. You see what I mean? And in England, if you remember, and in this area, if you did any petty crime, they'd hang you, you know. Once they knew you were a criminal, it didn't matter. You were hung, okay? And not only that, but it'd destroy your family's name, and on it goes, okay? And so the last thing they wanted to do was have him hung and you know, ruin their whole ministry family and everything else. So aged Fletcher has this man come up to him the next day, and he lies to him, you know, and he says, look at the money that your brother gave me. And he knew it was a lie. He's not an idiot, you know, and he knew that his brother was too wise, and the last, you know, you're the last person in the world I'd give that to. You know, I mean, that was kind of the response, you know, no way. And so Fletcher didn't shy down, guys. And the guy said, he pulled the same pistol out on Fletcher, and he said, you know, either shut up, you know, basically, and get out of my face, or I'm going to kill you. And Fletcher didn't back down. Fletcher sat there and preached at him fearlessly and said, do you think God, who keeps me alive day after day, is going to allow you to do something like that? I mean, that's just guts. You talk about guts. And the guy's got the gun pointed right at his chest, you know, and he's barely able to stand, and he sits there in his face, and he tells him right at him, he says, you're wrecking your life. You've done this. I know that's not what my brother would do. I know you're lying to me. You're going to get yourself in huge trouble here. Do you see what I mean? And he just keeps preaching at him, and the guy is mad at first, but pretty soon Fletcher can see that his words are breaking him. Do you get what I mean? And so he never wins him over to Christ. Do you get what I mean? But he's able to press him so bad with the words and the fearful statements he was making that the man backs down. And then he allows Fletcher, probably not because he really wanted him to, but because he didn't know what else to do, he allows Fletcher to pray for him. And so Fletcher on the spot prays for him, and he allows him to do that. And then he says, I'm going to try to get the family, you know, the whole family, not only my brother, to restore this amount of money to you. And I'm going to give some. I'm going to try to get my other cousins and family members to give you some. Do you see what I mean? Why? Because it covers their whole name. So he doesn't have to be hung. And so this whole thing doesn't have to tragically hit his family. Do you hear what I'm saying? And so he was able to do that, guys. And, you know, even with crazy behaviors like that happening against him, he was able to keep, you know, a Christian attitude, a Christian mind. You know, I think that's pretty awesome. So that's it. You know, we pretty much covered everything I was hoping to cover this morning. So let's pray. Father, I thank you for your word, and I thank you for the truth of it, Lord, when it's put in practical life. And I thank you for Fletcher's example to us, and I thank you for, you know, the ones we see in our day. Help us to live that life in front of people, Lord, no matter what things are confronting us, and no matter how hard our health, you know, tries us or anything else. I pray our passion for you would remain the same. We'd witness anywhere and everywhere, Lord, and we'd always have fruit. And we'd stay so connected with you. We'd have face-to-face experience. We'd have, you know, agony. We'd have anything you can give us so that when we get around others, you said, freely you have received, so freely give. Help us to do that. I pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.